should be
Well,
on.
Betty should probably be here, but the rest of it, wherever you want. Probably you guys with us share blank somewhere. Not sure, there may be enough.
And then we have Moxie from the bottom.
Or,
This one up here, actually, yeah.
It looks like, Daniel, you'll have your own mic, I think.
oh, perfect. So actually, I guess we have more than 5 minutes if
That's
Dennis isn't here.
yeah. So it's gonna be.
Uh-oh.
I mean, Dick and Betty are filling in for Dennis's chapter.
Okay, so they can still
So,
talk.
yeah.
So probably about the same.
It's gonna be about. I
Yeah.
think it's gonna be about what they sort of expected.
Yeah. All right. Well, I have exactly 5 minutes. So it's all right.
Right.
You'll be here, Betty. Betty?
I'm gonna go upstairs.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Chicago Public Library's Winter Garden on a wintry day. I'm Mariela Colon. I'm with the Civic, Cultural, and Literary Engagement Department, and on behalf of everyone here at the library, welcome. Before we begin, we ask that you please turn off your cell phones. I would like to thank all of the staff and the Society of Midland Authors for putting together tonight's wonderful event. Books are available for purchase from Sandmeyer's, and at the conclusion of the program, the authors will be signing the books. Tonight's event is also being live streamed on CPL's YouTube and will be available for on-demand viewing immediately following the event. After the conversation, our guest will field questions at the end of the program, and so please hold on to your questions till the conclusion of the program, and we will field them at that time. I'm also on the theme of tonight's program on Chicago mayors. Please take a second to check out our long-standing special collections exhibition on Harold Washington, the Man and the Legacy, which is located just to the right of the Winter Garden program. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to our moderator for the evening to get started. Thank you.
So delighted that all of you could make it through the snow, and to our YouTube audience as well tonight. As you know, we have our book, Chicago Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot, and I wanted to particularly give a shout out and thanks to the Society of Midland Authors for co-sponsoring this event with the Harold Washington Library, and to Mayor Wazinski, who is in fact the program chair for the Society of Midland Authors. And I don't know if she's here, but I wondered also if she is. I'm sorry? Yeah, no, I know you are. The next person, I don't know if she's here. Martha Bain, are you here? Would you stand, Martha? Martha is our editor from the University of Illinois Press, and I can't tell you how much better she made this book and makes us look much better as well. Each speaker is going to have only 10 minutes, so that there'll be time for questions at the end of the program, and they are in order. My co-editor, Betty O'Shaughnessy, who's going to cover the introduction to the book and the Harold Washington chapter. Harold Washington chapter was written by Zolela Mache, and Gregory Squires. Monroe Anderson wrote the chapter on Eugene Sawyer. Dennis Judd and Costa Spiru wrote the important chapter on Richard M. Daley, and I'll summarize their findings. And then for Rahm Emanuel, we have Kari Lyderson and Daniel Bliss. And I will end with the conclusion, but also Marco Rosaire Rossi and I wrote the chapter on Lori Lightfoot. We're not going to give a quiz. We don't expect you to know all the authors, but they're a fine set of journalists. They're a good set of sociologists and political scientists. So there are very different points of view about each of these mayors. And so I will turn it over to Betty to introduce our program tonight.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
A little closer to you.
How's that? Okay. Our new book is called Chicago's Modern Mayors, and it's really a follow-up to another book. Melvin Holly and Paul Green wrote a book called The Mayors in 1983, and it went through 4 editions. And the first edition came out right around the time that Harold Washington was elected, and the last one came out right around the time Rahm Emanuel was elected. We're going to do what they did was they talked about the mayors throughout our whole history that they thought were important, and they had different authors write about them. What we're going to do today is we're going to tell the story of Chicago's recent mayors, from Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot. And we're going to trace Chicago politics and government during their administration, see how it changed and stayed the same, from the end of the 20th century to the beginning of the 21st century. Now, Chicago changes during this time. Those of you that grew up here will know what I mean, especially. There was a population decrease. We were no longer the second city in population. There was a shift in economic development. We went from manufacturing economy to a global and a service economy. So that was different with the people that worked for them. We had a shrinking middle class and increasing income gap between the rich and the poor, and whites were no longer in the majority in the city, and that caused a change in race relationship in the balance of power in all sorts of elections. All of the mayors we discussed governed during financial, economic, and social crisis, but all found economic development paramount. Their goal was all the same: make Chicago a success. And the mayors approached this basically in 2 ways. One was as an establishment or a builder mayor, or one would be a progressive reform mayor. You can't hear me?
When you lower your head, it's hard to hear.
Oh, okay. Now, an establishment mayor, okay. Can I take this thing off?
No, leave it on,
Okay.
it's better.
Okay. Establishment mayor, when we think of an establishment mayor, we think of the old machine. We think of Anton Cermak. We think of Ed Kelly. We think of Richard J. Daley. They are mayors that had patronage, we saw crooked contracts there. We saw rigged elections. We even saw this with a Republican, Big Bill Thompson, if you want to go back far enough. The modern establishment mayor is a little different. He's an entrepreneur. He sees himself as the CEO of the city. And he sets the city agenda, and that would be to attract important corporations to the city, attract tourists to the city. And what is good for business downtown is good for Chicago. Their support comes from wealthy donors, often national party leaders. They get loyalty from party regulars, and the people that support them in the city are usually from the old immigrant groups, the Irish, the Polish, the Italians. And you also have sometimes police groups or other old-fashioned unions. Establishment mayors that we talk about in this book would be Richard M. Daley and Rahm Emanuel. Now, on the other hand, hello? Sorry about that. The other kind of mayor that we have are progressive reform mayors. Now, in the old days, like over 100 years ago, we had progressive mayors. We had William Deaver, we had Edward Dunn. And these guys were civil reformers. They believed in good government. That was their thing. Modern progressive reform mayors do that, but they also want reforms to end injustice. They prioritize the needs of the communities and the neighborhoods. They get support from city reform organizations. They get reform from small businesses, from new immigrant groups, Latinas, Dominicans, black voters, but also independents. And they also get money from wealthy donors like George Clooney. So that's the kind of people that give them money. The progressive mayors we talk about in this are Harold Washington, Lori Lightfoot, to a certain extent Brandon Johnson, but we had to finish the book before he was elected, and to a certain extent Eugene Sawyer. The differences between the establishment mayors and the progressive reform mayors leads to a renewal of the struggle between establishment and progressive reform politicians. Now, the way we approach this is that we ask the authors to answer 3 different questions for each of their mayors. First question is, how did this person become mayor? What were the conditions at the time? How were they persuaded to run? What was their agenda? Who were their supporters, both money-wise and vote-wise? Who were their opponents? And the election strategies. Second, what were their relations with the city council like? Was it a rubber stamp kind of council, or was it an independent kind of council that did what they wanted? The third question was, what was this mayor's legacy? What were their successes and failures? What were their conflicts? Who were their rivals? What were the precedents set in dealing with crises? Because all of them dealt with some sort of crises. Now, today, many aspects of Chicago governance still need reform for the city to successfully maintain its position as a global city. And the unforeseen happenings, the crises that all of these mayors have gone through, have shown that the future is uncertain. Chicago has to continue to address questions of racism, crime, and neighborhood inequalities. But all of the mayors must build on the successes of both types of former mayors, and so have taken on qualities of both progressive reformers and establishment builders, encouraging successful economic growth downtown, like establishment mayors, while promoting community development, like the progressive reform. They all try to do both. They need to find ways to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor, and they might provide leadership in times of crises. And these are the lessons of the modern mayors of Chicago, and this is what we go through. Okay, now I'm going to talk about Harold Washington. The book begins with Harold Washington because this election was the turning point. In one of your things, Dick Simpson said that there was a time before Harold and a time after Harold, and it is so true. This is an exciting chapter to see how they pulled this off. There were 2 mayors after Richard J. Daley and before Harold Washington. One was Michael Bilandic, who was just carrying on what Richard J. Daley did. And the second one was Jane Byrne, who did run as a progressive and did have the support of the independents and black voters. However, as time went on during her administration, she became more and more like the old Richard J. Daley type of thing, and she worked closely with establishment aldermen. And this angered black voters, independent voters. They said, we've got to get our own person in there. And the favorite choice they had was Harold Washington, who was a congressman at the time in Washington. Harold Washington did not want to run, but he said, if you get me $100,000 and 50,000 new registered voters, I'll do it. And they did, and he did. He ran and he won. He wouldn't have won except for the fact that he ran against two white candidates, and it was a close race, and all three of them got about a third of the vote. But Harold got 36%, so he won. His administration was as revolutionary as his election. He did not have an easy time of it because the city council was very much against what he was doing, and they would vote against him, and they had just enough votes to keep his stuff from getting passed, but he could veto them. So nobody had anything got done, and that's council wars. Okay. Now, what happened, though, was there was an election, and he was able to get his own votes in, and he got his own agenda filled. He institutionalized the values of the movement that elected him: good government, progressive reform, community needs. He cleaned up the bureaucracy, ended moonlighting. He encouraged affirmative action and minority jobs and contracts. The Standard & Poor ratings were raised. Women and minority department heads rose to 40% of them, where it had only just been token employees. Now, no mayor after Harold Washington eliminated any of these reforms. They're still in place today. And that's why he was the most important mayor as far as the progressive reforms. He paved the way for Barack Obama's election as well. Thank you.
Great. Now we have the hard task, as you can see, about each mayor. We could have spent the whole program on that mayor, but thank you, Betty. We have Monroe Anderson, who was the press secretary for Eugene Sawyer, who's going to cover the Eugene Sawyer administration.
Eugene Sawyer was the between a rock and a hard place mayor. He came into office after Harold Washington died, and he came into office after or during this very chaotic election process, which had been changed after Mayor Richard J. Daley died. And there was this black alderman, Wilson Frost, who, if he had been white and if he had been from the 11th Ward, would have automatically become mayor. But since he was neither, all the white aldermen had a meeting and locked him out, literally locked him out, and decided the successor to Mayor Daley. As a result of that, you got a law where the city council got to elect the next mayor. It had to be a vote instead of them in a smoke-filled room afterwards. And so Harold dies, and the way Harold had won was the white vote was split in Chicago. You had two popular white candidates, Mayor Byrne and Richard M. Daley. They split the white vote, and although many never thought that the black community would actually vote for a black mayor, would stick together enough to elect one, it happened. It had happened because it had become literally a movement. It was more than just an election. Blacks on the west side, blacks on the south side, all decided, because Jane Byrne had really upset them, that they were going to elect a black, and so you got this movement going. It was like a civil rights movement, but more. You got that going. Harold was elected, and what was really interesting about that election is that when Harold won the primary, beating out Byrne and Daley, and became the general election candidate, suddenly most white Democrats in the city saw the light and decided they were Republicans. And they became Republicans literally overnight, just because Harold was black. He gets into office, and for 3 years, you have council wars. There were 29 white aldermen who voted consistently. I mean, what's really interesting about this, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, and this one was really rhyming. The white Republicans, God, there you go. the white Democrats did everything against Harold that they could. They just tried to make it difficult for them to run government. So there was this thing called council wars going on, where they just fought it out for 3 years. And after that, there was a change. Harold came into power for a matter of months, and he died. And so suddenly, the seat is vacant. And the white alderman in the city thought, okay, well, that was an interesting interlude, but we can go back to business as usual. The blacks and liberals in the city council had a different idea. They had tasted freedom, so they were going to do it. George Dunn was the Democrat, he's the leader of what was left of the machine, the old Chicago machine. And he says you cannot put a white person in alderman in Harold Washington's seat, or there will be rioting in Chicago. So, with that dilemma going on, what the white alderman who had been the 29 decided, well, we'll put our kind of black into power. They chose Eugene Sawyer. Eugene Sawyer had been in office longer than most in the city council, and he was quiet. He was a nice man. Everybody liked him. When he became mayor, the reporters at City Hall started looking up quotes or clips, TV clips. He was the honest to goodness invisible man. He had never done an interview. He had never had anything to say. I mean, nobody knew who he was except for people in the city council, of course. And so he was their idea of a compromise. Their plan from the beginning was either he would do their will or they'd get rid of him. He was no Harold Washington. I mean, he was not a brilliant speaker. He was not a magnetic personality. He was just Gene. And so they fought December 1 and December 2. And much of this was on TV, live TV. They fought over whether he should become mayor. There were white aldermen who just thought they'd test their luck no matter what Don said.
2 minutes.
And
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. And then there was Evans. Tim Evans was declared the heir apparent to Harold Washington. And mainly because he was a better speaker than Sawyer. He had gathered the movement together, and he thought he'd be the guy. The white aldermen put Sawyer in. They gave him their votes, and immediately the black community was split, just as the white community had been split when Daley died. Sawyer was interim mayor. He was there for 18 months, and then the white aldermen ran their candidate, Richard M. Daley. Tim Evans still challenging Sawyer with this big lie that he was the heir apparent. And we got Daley for 22 years. I'll cut it off there.
Okay. There's time for questions on all of these. So pretend I'm Dennis Judd. He's not able to be here this evening. He lives in St. Louis, and you can imagine with the weather, it's difficult to be here. He and the provost, he's a UIC professor emeritus, and the provost from Georgia State University, Costa Spiro, wrote about Richard M. Daley. And this is just a part of what they said in their remarks. They started out trying to write the story of what we came to call, that is the two authors, the city of spectacle. But they discovered that the city of spectacle can't be told without recognizing Daley as its chief author, architect, and builder. He was, as Monroe just said, the longest serving mayor in the history of Chicago, serving from 1989 to 2016. And he presided over a period of stability that had not been seen since his father's time. One of Daley's most enduring legacies, according to our authors, is that he calmed the racial waters after council wars. And he won his 1989 three-way race in a contest in which he secured only 5% of the African-American vote. But he got 89% of the white vote and a majority of the Latino vote, and was therefore elected. At the same time, particularly as he became mayor, he forged an unbreakable bond with the business leaders, the civic elites, the corporations, and the philanthropic community. And that alliance made it possible for him to pursue his extraordinary, ambitious, and coherent revitalization program. He had companies like Boeing and ADM and Exelon and others either stay in Chicago or move here. 19 of the 30 largest, tallest buildings in downtown Chicago were completed during the Daley years. And of course, you know about Millennium Park and the development of the lakeway, of the lake area. All through his 5 terms, which Daley served as mayor, each year, Chicago officials announced new public projects and dozens of office towers and residential buildings sprouting up all over the city, particularly the lakefront. And he created a heady atmosphere of optimism. We could come back. We could be Chicago again. In a few short years, Chicago was, by many measures, transformed from a troubled industrial city into a much-hyped global powerhouse. Practically no one, however, gave him passing marks for the succession of corruption scandals that dogged him year after year, or for the constant reports of police brutality, or for the city's deteriorating financial condition. Near the end of his term in office, Daley sold valuable city assets and privatization deals that yielded short-term solutions and long-term budgetary problems, like the selling of the Skyway and the selling of the parking meters. It's important to acknowledge that the remaking of Chicago's lakefront and economy under Daley's leadership should be regarded as a significant achievement. The city of spectacle remade Chicago, and this is Daley's enduring legacy. However, one of the strangest things that happened is that he seems to have disappeared from public memory. Almost immediately after leaving the mayor's office, he wasn't to be seen, he didn't wield power, he didn't continue to have an effect. And this forgetting of Mayor Daley and our recent past is not reassuring as we think about our future. And now I'll turn it over to our two speakers who are going to talk about the Rahm Emanuel mayoralty.
Yeah, well, I'm very happy to be here and be talking about Chicago mayors. I'm Kari Lyderson. And yeah, so Rahm Emanuel, like Mayor Daley in the framing of this book, was definitely an establishment mayor, and actually was more similar to Daley than probably was apparent, but very different in sort of brand and style. Rahm Emanuel came in with the real sort of mentality and approach of a CEO, and not only for the big business, high finance world that he was coming from, but also the sort of startup culture, move fast, break things kind of approach. And he didn't have this air of being a Chicagoan, didn't actually grow up in Chicago, didn't have the sort of Chicago style, the accent, the ability to rub shoulders with union members and do the things that endeared Mayor Daley to a lot of people. Even both symbolically and legally, his candidacy was challenged early on by the tenant who was renting his house while he was in Washington, challenging that Rahm didn't actually live in Chicago and wasn't eligible. He was able to beat that and ultimately to win election pretty handily. But that style continued to characterize his tenure and really ultimately be his downfall. He didn't seem to have the ability or willingness to do what maybe for Daley was largely lip service, but that Daley did do in consulting with community leaders and organized labor leaders, and really even part of the patronage system, playing ball with all the power brokers in the city. And Rahm had that very corporate efficiency-driven approach that he instituted from day one, or really even in his promises before he took office. To kind of jump ahead to some of the highlights or lowlights of his tenure, he closed half of the city's public mental health clinics early on in his first budget. He, not too long after, oversaw the closing of more than 50 Chicago public schools. And these are both perfect instances of things that might have made sense on paper, looking at the numbers, the economics, but Rahm, by doing this, was absolutely failing to realize just how important, or maybe realizing, but not caring how important these institutions are to Chicagoans, and that, something, even with the city in dire financial straits, the bottom line is, not the only thing that matters. And that really played out in highly public ways with patients or clients of the mental health clinics desperately pleading for him to keep their clinics open at a cost that wasn't actually that much in the larger scheme of things, and parents and teachers and students literally crying and begging to keep their schools open at meetings that were held across the city, but that Rahm rarely attended, and that didn't seem to result in any impact on the decisions on school closings that were ultimately made. And then, as I said, Rahm's style was a lot different than Daley, but a lot of the substance actually ended up being pretty similar, just an ongoing push for privatization and for trimming the role of the city in providing services and jobs. And yeah, so these things continued, things continued to dog Emanuel. He was pushed into a runoff with Chuy Garcia in 2015, and what really is maybe the most notorious incident during his reign was playing out then. Laquan McDonald had been fatally shot by Officer Jason Van Dyke in the fall of 2014. It didn't get a lot of attention then, and as later came to light, Rahm's administration had really orchestrated a cover-up of the details around the killing to make sure that they didn't become public around the 2015 runoff election. And that ultimately, the actual killing of Laquan McDonald showed that the problems with the police that had long existed, the racism and the brutality and the lack of accountability, had gotten no better under Rahm. Meanwhile, violence was actually getting worse than it had been in the later years of Daley's term. So Jason Van Dyke's trial was underway as the election season for the 2019 race was starting, and that's when Rahm Emanuel announced that he would not run for re-election. And there's a lot of pieces of his legacy, not all bad. There was plenty of good things that happened for the city during that time. But I think one of the most interesting and important parts of his legacy is really how it galvanized the public and how community organizations and unions, especially the Chicago Teachers Union, and different actors in the city were energized by his actions and by organizing against Rahm and tapping into what was also really simmering on the national level at that time, just a growing class consciousness. So it really, if you remember the tenure of the debates during the campaign that Lori Lightfoot ultimately won, you had all the candidates making really progressive statements, and even the mental health clinics, even today, have continued to be a huge issue beyond the number and the dollar amounts. So Rahm really continues in some ways to set the agenda for the city in positive ways because of how the public has responded to his time in office. So I'll turn it over to Daniel.
So I'm Daniel Bliss. Are you getting a sound here? Good, okay. I'm Daniel Bliss, Associate Professor of Political Science at Illinois Institute of Technology, and my contribution to this chapter was looking at a lot of the sort of management patterns, as well as Rahm Emanuel's approach to infrastructure and new economic development. And it's a really interesting mixture. There's some significant innovation to come out of the Emanuel administration on both infrastructure and economic development, and yet yet along with it, some significantly bullheaded management decisions and choices of senior leadership in management that I think somewhat wore him down as we went on over the course of his administration. One thing I want to bring up, because I think it's certainly something that comes up a lot with my students, is transit infrastructure. A striking feature of the Daley administration was the way in which they simply would not share significant property tax resources with transits. Illinois, of course, for a long time now, since the late 1940s, has had significant state involvement in transit funding, and since the early 1980s, that involvement has focused on a regional sales tax. And Daley would not switch that, even as the CTA's infrastructure needs were becoming more and more apparent. Rahm Emanuel brings in a commissioner from New York, Gabe Klein, with a very innovative view of transit mobility. Also, of course, Klein is in charge of Chicago Department of Transportation, not specifically the CTA. But Emanuel also was hit with a very dramatic incident in his first year where the roof literally blew off the Bryn Mawr Red Line station. It was all rotten wood, and they found they had to spend $100 million on the North Red Line simply to keep an operating certificate for it. And one thing that was born out of that episode was the Red and Purple Modernization Project, where he brought in he went in his, Emanuel really went in his comfort zone here. He went to an expert at CMAP, a woman named Chrissy Mancini-Nichols. She suggested rejigging the infamous tax increment financing policies of Chicago in a way that would not hold the school and counties liable like other TIF projects do, but come mainly out of city property taxpayers. And they were able to use that with an unusual degree of bipartisan cooperation. Mike Madigan and Bruce Rauner put aside their conflict in the summer of 2016. They got this all rolled out. They actually got everything done in time for November 15th deadline, so they didn't have to deal with the Trump administration on it, whereas Caltrain out in San Francisco, who'd been ahead of them, ran into some significant trouble there by missing that deadline. The result is that, that they're actually getting substantive work done, and they're doing it with a very significant amount of property tax money from mostly wealthier parts of the city. More generally, we see a much more rapid pace of infrastructure maintenance from the Emanuel administration. We were seeing maybe 80 to 100 miles a year of city street infrastructure repair and so on under the Emanuel administration. Rahm Emanuel delivered almost 2,200 miles over his 8 years. It was about 250, 260 miles a year of street improvements. And at that rate, you'd do the whole city in less than 20 years. You look at you look at some of the things Emanuel had to do. 1 minute, okay. You look at some of the things Emanuel had to do as mayor with regard to finance, and he inherited a very unfavorable situation from Daley. You had a pension situation that was out of control and remains extremely precarious, and I'm sure there'll be more of that in the question and answer. But I'd also like to close out here with a reference to some of the some aspects of management, which is that after a very promising start, Emanuel sort of retreats into a comfort zone here, a comfort zone that a lot of CEO-type characters fall into, of appointing people where they trust the loyalty and don't look enough at the skill set and the personality and how they're equipped to do the job. You see that with his succession of school superintendents. Jean-Claude Brizard, Barbara Byrd Bennett, who ended up in jail, Forrest Claypool, who had no experience in education whatsoever, and then Janice Jackson, who had a whole bevy of problems with special ed and sex abuse cases in the school, and then over at the police department as well. And perhaps most notoriously, we don't mention it in the book, but I do have to mention Emanuel was the one who's responsible for appointing Dorval Carter to run the CTA, who's getting a great deal of bad press right now, and I think a fair bit of it justified. So it's a mixed bag, but I think because of the bubble Emanuel inhabits, some of the positive things he did with economic development and infrastructure can easily get lost. And I think that's an essential part of the story there.
Years of Chicago history in 50 minutes. I'm sure your head is spinning when we go through 40 years of Chicago history in 50 minutes. But in each chapter, we raise issues and take a strong take on what was different about the mayors. And I'm going to finish with the end of the book, which is Lori Lightfoot. As you know, Lori Lightfoot was elected and governed by a coalition of two overlapping groups, the good government reformers and the progressives. And the point we make in the overall part of the book is there was an arc that went from Harold Washington's reform and progressive mayoralty to the Lori Lightfoot reform and progressive mayoralty. Now, she was elected as a reformer because Alderman Ed Burke and Tony Preckwinkle got involved in a scandal with which I'm sure you're familiar. Rahm Emanuel, for some of the reasons that were given, dropped out. But when he dropped out, he had, if he'd run, he dropped out in September, he had 31% of the electorate supporting him. Now, the problem with 31% of support when you're the chief executive for 8 years is that doesn't bode well for your election opportunities. But most of the other candidates had only 16% support, and Lori Lightfoot had only 3% support. Now, there were two arguments being made in the campaign that year. One, by candidates like Mendoza and Preckwinkle, they argued that they should be elected because of their experience in government, while Lightfoot argued that significant reforms were needed, and a majority of the voters opted for Lightfoot's definition, particularly after the Burke scandals. The other candidates also had more money. Bill Daley had $9 million. Preckwinkle had $5 million. Lori Lightfoot had only $1.5 million, but that was enough. She was endorsed by the Chicago Sun-Times. She ran TV ads that you probably remember that portrayed Preckwinkle, Mendoza, Chico, and Daley as members of the corrupt clique of politicians that had been gouging the city for years. And those images stuck with the public, again, particularly after the Burke scandal. So Lightfoot won with only 17.5% of the vote, as opposed to Harold Washington's 36% 40 years earlier. And she went on to win the election, however, with 74% of the vote, carrying all 50 wards. Now, Rahm Emanuel and Richard M. Daley, for instance, had a rubber stamp city council. But under Lightfoot, 12 new aldermen had been elected, and the council split into 4 factions. The Center Liberal Bloc, which was mostly the committee chairs and lakefront liberals, the Progressive Caucus and the Democratic Socialists, the Machine Bloc with aldermen like Burke, and the Conservative Bloc from the Northwest Side aldermen who were really closet Republicans. So the council was split. And Mayor Lightfoot encountered big challenges and crises during her administration, most notably the COVID-19 pandemic, and generally she handled them well. Better than, for instance, Mayor Johnson's handling of the asylum seeker and migrant crisis in our city so far. She had the same reform and progressive goals that motivated Mayor Washington. One of her key programs, for instance, that you will remember is Invest Southwest. She wanted to redirect the money from the city, but also the private sector, into the parts of the city that had been neglected under the programs like the Daley and Emanuel period, which wanted to develop the loop. And she was lucky to have a working majority in the city council, unlike the council wars that plagued Mayor Washington. She achieved in general more of her reform than her progressive goals. But both Mayor Washington and Lori Lightfoot were in part of this arc of reform that continues today under the Brandon Johnson administration. So what do we learn from the study of these 5 mayors? First, as Betty said in the beginning, we as Chicago have oscillated back and forth between establishment builder mayors and progressive reform mayors, and that is a trend that continues today. Second, we've moved from a manufacturing to a service to a global economy, but we still have racial and economic inequality and a widening income gap. The percent of the city's census blocks that are middle class have dropped from 47% to 16%. The middle class is disappearing, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. Third, whites are no longer the dominant racial group. It has taken a coalition in every one of these elections to get elected, and the coalitions have been different. For instance, Harold Washington had the bedrock support of the African American community and the support of progressives and the Latino and white community. That was his Rainbow Coalition. On the other hand, Mayor Richard M. Daley had support, as I mentioned earlier, with 89% of the white vote and only 7% of the black vote. It was still a divided city when he first took over, although he continued to get more African American votes as he stayed in office. Fourth, the city council has been fundamentally transformed from a rubber stamp city council into something more resembling a genuine legislative body. Fifth, in documenting the last 40 years, we can understand them and we can choose a more positive future. But last of all, that struggle for the future of Chicago is not over. And we've tried to leave plenty of time for questions. We can ask your questions up until 7:15. The library will pass around a microphone. If you'll speak in the microphone, remember we're being recorded on YouTube, so it helps not only the audience here, but the audience that's seeing it on television or on their computer.
Yes, now we're good.
Hi, this is a question about Eugene Sawyer. It sounded like he was I was a kid when he was elected or put in office. It sounded like he was a reluctant mayor. Did he want to be, or what?
He was a reluctant mayor. During the December 1 and 2 knockdown, drag-out fight in the city council, there were times when he says, okay, because what Burke told him was that if he didn't take the job, they were going to put a white alderman in. And so he didn't want that to happen, as did the others, and the other blacks and progressives in the city council. So he was going to take it, but then he was afraid because you had the Harold Washington administration and the more aggressive black politicos backing Tim Evans, and they had had a meeting at the UIC at the stadium there, and they had decided that Tim Evans was the heir apparent. Harold did not name an heir apparent. Harold was not joking when he said he was going to be mayor for 20 years. But anyway, so Sawyer was back and forth. It was a Hamlet situation where, yeah, he wanted it, no, he didn't want it, and he kept going back and forth. I mean, at one point, Burke brought in Sawyer's ministers, the Wyatts, and they all prayed together with Burke's instigation. Okay, why don't we pray on this? So no, he was not sure at all, because he was being called an Uncle Tom and all sorts of things, none of which was true, and he wasn't comfortable with it. And he wasn't comfortable with the media. That's why he hadn't been there. As his press secretary, there would be issues that would arise, and I'd tell him, you have to go out and talk to him. And he said, you go out and talk to him, Monroe. So, yeah, he was reluctant.
The other point that he makes on, that Monroe makes on the Sawyer chapter is that Sawyer actually carried out the progressive agenda of Harold Washington, and that's not well understood. You'll have to read the book to get the details.
I was hoping you might review.
Next, it's better if we have the mic on people again. Who had their hand up back here?
Yeah.
Hold on. Oh, no, you'll be next if you would just give him a second test.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I will get you.
Sorry. Anyway, I just wanted you to review the voter turnout through these elections and break it down by black, white, Hispanic, and so on if you can. Just curious, were there ever elections when an actual majority of eligible voters put a mayor in office?
I'd be happy to take that. If you go back to the 1983 election, voter turnout there was over 82%. You had, I believe the number is 1,336,000 total votes in that runoff. And to put that in perspective, the 2008 presidential election year, which was a notably high turnout with Barack Obama on the ballot, was around 1.1 million for the city. We have had nothing like that since. If we take a look, for example, at the 2011 election, Rahm Emanuel's 55+% of the vote was in reality about 325 1,000 or so. So you're looking at 600K for those recent elections.
In reference to Mayor Sawyer, as to, was he timid? What was really going on? I do know that Sawyer was profoundly interested in nurturing in his private life as well as continuing on into the public arena after Mayor Washington. He was profoundly aware of lifting up his own family, his own son, bringing him to a level where he could far more easily move out into the public forum than he had. And he did that within the educational system. He did link up with a manner of doing things that brought an educated young man out, very much like what Martin Luther King attempted to do before he was so profoundly circled by blue-collar people, where the understanding of what has to be done is radically different. So that Jesuit education, be it for that Roman Catholic man or just for that young man, was very, very essential to Mayor Sawyer. Plus, for some strange reason, Mayor Sawyer was a gentleman. And I think that was very rare. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a question online. Just a second. So this is probably for everyone. Which of these mayor's mistakes is now the biggest problem for Mayor Johnson that he's dealing with?
Clear what you mean. Which of the mayors is the biggest problem for our current mayor? Is that?
Out of all the different mayors, it says which of the mayors is the biggest issue right now that Mayor Johnson's having to face up.
Well, I think the answer to that is that all of these mayors had major accomplishments. They were very different. But we had, for instance, the examples of Daley and Emanuel as builder mayors and what they built. Easiest to see is the City of Spectacle on the lakefront by Daley that built so much over his 20 years. The groundbreaking things that Mayor Washington did, or even that Lori Lightfoot achieved, those are high benchmarks for any mayor. So all of the mayors set a different kind of standard, and the current mayor has to try and figure out how to achieve his own goals and how to make them all happen. He started to try and do that in his administration, but it's very young administration so far, and so far he obviously hasn't achieved the same things that the other mayors we're talking about tonight have. Go ahead, sure.
The problem Lightfoot had and Johnson is having is that Mayor Richard M. Daley sold all the geese that laid the golden eggs. So there's very little revenue, mainstream revenue now. And they're scrambling just to keep the city running for that reason.
There's two questions over at this side. We have time for several more questions. We have to stop, though, at 7:15.
I have a comment and a question. I was a former Chicago Teachers Union delegate, and we went through 3 strikes with Rahm. My comment is that we might not even had Mayor Johnson had not Emanuel awakened the sleeping giant of the CTU just by bothering the hell out of us all the time. And he just, and that's kind of a comment, and I think there is some validity to it. God, we went through the strikes with that man. But the comment, and you just kind of stole my question, but killing the loose goose that laid the golden egg was the parking. I have friends in small business. They say the parking meter deal just killed our city. It's just the worst thing that's happened since the Chicago fire. I just comment on that.
instance of Chicago fire, but you're generally correct. The parking meters, the reason the parking meter deal was bad is, first of all, we should have gotten $1 billion or $2 more billion out of it. But secondly, we spent all the parking meter money within the first 2 years. Daniel?
The parking meter thing has stripped the city of control over its streets in a way that you just don't see in any other major city. The CTA was well advanced on bus rapid transit plans. That got completely quashed by not having control over the streets. You got a $1.1 billion one-off payment that even at the time the Inspector General said probably should have been double that, and now we're hearing estimates as high as $9 billion as to the true value. And so this is going to be something the city's stuck with for many decades that other major cities are not stuck with.
So I'm not originally from Chicago. I've only been here about years. And I'm a professor of international relations, so I know nothing about urban politics. But I don't understand why, if Mayor Lightfoot was a progressive reformer, why during the election that brought in Brandon Johnson, she was so vilified for not being progressive. So I know that might be a bigger question, but can you just explain, if she's so progressive, why was she out progressived?
To the election was that she was crabby. She got people mad, not because of any of her policies. I think people were voting for her against her crabbiness. This is a very simplistic answer, but that was the way I saw it. There were some things that she said she was going to do that some of these people would know more better than I would, but I think that that was one of the things. She was not a popular mayor. When she started out and she did all those funny pictures of herself all over the place against COVID, you could see that people were going to warm to her, but she stopped that, and she stopped meeting with people, and she stopped doing a lot of things like that.
Okay, and we have the last question.
I think one dynamic at work there is because of the public reaction to Rahm during her campaign. This is maybe just my opinion, but I feel like she framed herself as more progressive than maybe she was at heart, and sort of set up some, promises that were hard for her to live up to, and maybe weren't even her choice of exactly the best policy. And then ultimately her part of her undoing was very similar to Rahm's, as different as they might have been in other ways, just that sort of crabbiness or aggressiveness, or inability to really consult with people and work with people in a way that left them feeling satisfied.
The beginning of the end for Rahm was what the cops did to Laquan McDonald that day on Pulaski Road. And I'm wondering, from a political tactical standpoint, what would have happened if Rahm had gotten on top of that and said, look what happened out there. This is terrible. I think it's bad. We have to reform the police department and police procedures, and I'm the guy who can lead you there. Would things have turned out different?
Would have been a gamble, but he might have ended up a national hero, especially knowing 4 years or 6 years later how the country responded to George Floyd's killing. So that would have been good political advice for him at the time, probably.
I think there's a fundamental, I'd just like to add, I think there's a fundamental timidity amongst a whole generation of Democratic politicians, and it was symbolized in that moment by Rahm Emanuel.
We'll take one more question. Well, that needs to go to someone else who hasn't asked one. Just a minute.
Hi, I'm a lifelong Chicagoan, and I just wanted to see if the panel could comment on what I view as the lack of charisma in almost all of the mayors that are listed. The two that in my lifetime, I'm 75 years old, the two people I think that really had a connection with people were Richard J. Daley and Harold Washington. You know, when Richard J. Daley died, 20,000 people stood out in single-digit cold weather to view his casket. And there was the same type of grief that was experienced when Harold Washington died. I don't know if any of that would be experienced if any of on the passing of any of these other mayors. But I really think there's been a lack of charisma, and I just wanted to see if the panel could comment on if that's important or not.
Well, just to answer part of it, you expressed well what you think were the two charismatic mayors, but so a mayor has to do a lot of stuff, right? They've got to be charismatic, they've got to be warm and fuzzy, and people have to like them. They have to carry out reform policies, or builder mayors have to build the loop or the neighborhoods. This, hopefully, if nothing else is taken away from the book, given all the crisis we recount of the mayors, you'll have a little bit of appreciation for what it takes to be a mayor in a city like Chicago, and what amazing achievements have actually been accomplished, whether you like a particular mayor or not. What has been accomplished over the last 40 years has been phenomenal and has put Chicago hopefully on a good path for the future, depending on what we do. And we'll be glad to meet with you and sign books back here in the corner. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.